The night Silas Drummond called her a charity case in front of half of Millhaven, Nora Beckett didn't flinch. She had learned not to flinch years ago, standing at the back of her father's general store, watching men like Silas count coins on the counter, like they were doing God's own work just by spending money. She had learned to keep her face still while her hands went cold and her jaw went tight, and something behind her sternum pulled itself into a knot that wouldn't come loose for days. But the man beside her, the one who had walked her into the Millhaven Grange dinner without apology, without explanation, with one hand resting easy at the small of her back, that man was not from Millhaven. He didn't know the rules. His name was Cole Merritt. He had ridden into town 6 weeks earlier with 2 horses, a bedroll, and a surveyor's kit, and he had not yet learned to look away when Silas Drummond spoke. "I heard you were bringing someone tonight," Silas said, and he looked at Nora the way you look at mud tracked onto good flooring. "I didn't realize you meant to bring the Beckett girl, the one who's been living off the county since her daddy's store went under." The room didn't go quiet exactly. It sort of tightened. Like a held breath, Cole Merritt set down his fork. "She's been living off herself," he said. "Same as the rest of us. Maybe harder than most." He looked at Silas with the particular patience of a man who has already decided what he thinks, and is simply waiting for you to catch up. "And she's the most capable woman in this room, but I expect you already knew that. That's probably why you felt the need to say something." Silas's face did something complicated. The table did not speak. Nora felt the warmth of it move through her, like the first swallow of something hot on a cold morning. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just deeply, quietly steadying. She had not asked Cole to defend her. She did not need him to. But she had spent 3 years in this town being invisible in the loudest possible way, present at every gathering, discussed in every parlor, and never once spoken to as though she had something worth saying. She had buried her father, sold his inventory piece by piece, taken in sewing, and taught letters to the schoolmaster's overflow of students, and still Millhaven looked at her like a problem that hadn't resolved itself yet. Cole Merritt looked at her like she was the solution. That was the part she didn't know how to hold. Nora had grown up in Millhaven, which meant she had grown up understanding exactly where the lines were drawn and how thin they were. Her father, George Beckett, had run the only general store between the river and the ridge for 22 years, and when the drought took 3 seasons in a row, and then the mill closed, and then the railway went to Carsten instead of here, well, the store went with it, quietly. The way things go quietly in small towns where everyone sees it happening and nobody says a word. George died the winter after. Heart, the doctor said. Nora thought it was something more specific than that. She thought it was the particular kind of grief that lives in a man who has spent his life building something and watches it come apart in his hands before he's old enough to call it done. She was 26 when she buried him. She had no siblings, no husband, and no inheritance to speak of beyond the building itself, which had a lien on it from the Millhaven Savings and Credit, held by its director, a compact, precise man named Vernon Aldrich, who wore the same wool vest every day of the year regardless of weather, and smiled in a way that never quite reached his actual eyes. Vernon Aldrich had come to her father's funeral. He had shaken her hand. He had said, "Terrible loss. Your father was a good man." He had then, 3 days later, sent a letter informing her that the outstanding balance on the property loan, which she had not known existed in its full form, was due within 60 days, or the bank would move to claim the property. The number in the letter was not a number George Beckett could have signed his name to willingly. Nora knew her father's handwriting. She knew his accounts. She had helped him with the ledgers since she was 11 years old, sitting on a stool beside the counter with a pencil and a straight edge, learning to love the clean logic of numbers that balanced. These numbers did not balance. She had gone to Vernon Aldrich's office with the ledgers under her arm and a list of questions written out in careful columns, and he had looked at her with that unreadable smile and said the paperwork was all in order. He was sorry for her trouble. The 60 days stood. She had walked out of his office and stood on the wooden sidewalk in the October cold and looked at the street she had lived on her whole life, and felt for the first time genuinely afraid. Not of being poor. She already was poor. Not of working. She knew how to work. She was afraid that the law, the thing she had always believed in a simple, unexamined way, was on the side of what was right, might not actually be. Cole Merritt came to her 3 weeks after the Grange dinner. He came in the late afternoon, when the light went sideways and gold across the floor of the room she rented above the dry goods, and he knocked twice before she opened the door, and he was holding his hat in his hands, which she had already learned meant he was about to say something he wasn't sure would be welcome. "I've been looking at the land records," he said. She stepped back to let him in. Cole had come to Millhaven to survey parcels for a railway spur, not the main line, but an extension that would connect 3 small communities to the existing route. It was methodical work, careful work, the kind of work that required you to pull old maps and cross-reference claims and look at deeds that hadn't been touched in 20 years. He had spent 6 weeks in the county clerk's office, and in 6 weeks he had seen things. "Your father's loan," he said. "The original agreement." She poured him coffee. Her hands were steady because she made them be. "I requested the records through the clerk," he continued. "They're public documents, so Aldrich couldn't block it. And Nora—" He stopped. He looked at her with something careful in his face. "The rate on that loan is not the rate that's in his letter to you. The original agreement is at 4%. The letter quotes 8. And the principal amount in the letter is higher than the amount your father signed for." The room was very quiet. She stopped. "Fraud," Cole said. "If I'm reading it right. The signature on the amended document doesn't match the signatures on anything else your father ever filed with the county. I've seen enough survey work to know what forgery looks like." She sat down, not dramatically. She just sat down, because standing took more than she had in that moment. "Who else knows?" "Nobody yet." He turned his hat in his hands. "That's why I'm here. Because what happens next depends on what you want to do." What Nora wanted to do and what Nora knew she had to do were not quite the same thing. What she wanted was simple. She wanted her father's name cleared. She wanted the building back. She wanted Vernon Aldrich to stand in front of the people who had watched her be small for 3 years and have to account for what he had done. What she knew she had to do was harder, slower, and less satisfying in the short term. She had to learn enough to be the one who did the accounting. The county seat was 40 miles from Millhaven, which in October meant a full day's ride in conditions that were committed to being unpleasant. Nora made the trip 4 times in 6 weeks. She went to the land titles office. She went to the district court registry. She found a solicitor named Agnes Ford, one of the few women practicing in the territory, which Nora took as an immediate sign that she was talking to the right person, and she sat across from Agnes's desk and spread out everything she had. The original loan documents, the copy Cole had made of the county record, the letter from Aldrich, her father's ledgers going back 12 years. Agnes looked at everything for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "He's done this before." It was not a question. Agnes had seen 2 other cases in the past decade with Vernon Aldrich's fingerprints on them. Different names, same method. A widow in Carsten who had lost her husband's mill property. A farmer outside Greybell who had signed a loan in good faith and found himself paying double what he'd agreed to within 2 years. Both had eventually surrendered their properties. Neither had known there might be grounds to fight. "The problem," Agnes said, "is that Aldrich is the director of the bank and the appointed financial officer for the county's assessor's office. He has access to the originals. If he's had 3 years to cover his tracks. He hasn't covered everything," Nora said, "because he didn't expect anyone to look." That was the thing about Vernon Aldrich. He was meticulous in the ways that showed and careless in the ways he assumed no one would check. He had amended loan documents and falsified rates, but he had done it in his own office, in his own files, without worrying too much about the copies in the county clerk's archive, because the county clerk was 64 years old and had never once, in Nora's memory, refused Vernon Aldrich anything. But the county clerk was not the only copy that existed. George Beckett had kept copies of everything, every receipt, every agreement, every letter, filed by date in a wooden box under the counter of the store, and when the store went, Nora had taken the box without quite knowing why, out of sentiment, she'd thought, out of not being ready to let the last physical trace of her father's work disappear. She had never opened it after the funeral. It had sat on the shelf above her bed for 3 years, and she had looked at it every night, and she had not been able to make herself look inside. Cole had asked her gently if she wanted him there when she opened it. She had said no, and then she had said yes. and then she had sat on the floor of her rented room with the box between them and taken out every piece of paper one at a time while Cole made a second inventory list in his careful surveyor's handwriting. And by the time they were done, it was past midnight, and the original signed loan agreement, the real one, with the real rate, with her father's signature that matched every other signature in every other document, was lying on the floor between them like an answer to a question she had been too afraid to ask. She had cried then, not prettily. She had cried the way you cry when something has been wrong for a long time, and you've been holding the shape of it so carefully that when it finally starts to come undone, your whole body doesn't quite know what to do with the release. Cole had not tried to stop her. He had not said anything comforting. He had sat beside her on the floor and let her cry until it was done, and then he had said very quietly, "What do you need right now?" She had said, "Tea, and then we make a plan." He had made the tea. The hearing was not dramatic the way Nora had sometimes imagined it, in the small hours of the night when she let herself imagine it. It was a Monday morning in November, cold and gray, in a room at the district courthouse that smelled like wood polish and old paper. Vernon Aldrich arrived with his own solicitor, a man named Pembley, who had an impressive mustache, and the general air of someone accustomed to matters being resolved in his favor before they were fully weighted. Aldrich himself looked at Nora when he came in, just once. A quick, assessing look, the kind that takes inventory of what threat you actually are, and then he looked away, and she could see in the set of his shoulders that he had already decided she wasn't one. Agnes Ford set the documents on the table in a specific order. She had explained the order to Nora beforehand. You build toward the thing you want them to see. You don't lead with it. You let the picture assemble itself so that by the time you show them the last piece, the conclusion is not a surprise but an inevitability. The original loan agreement went down last. Pembley had a response ready. The document was irregular, he said. The date was unclear. There were questions about the chain of custody for documents kept in a private residence for 3 years. Agnes let him finish. Then she put Cole's survey records on the table. Every county archive document he had cross-referenced. Every date stamp. Every clerk's initialing going back to the original filing. The document from the Beckett family archive, Agnes said, in the dry, unhurried way of someone who has been patient for so long that patience has become simply her natural state, is consistent in every material detail with the county record filed at the time of signing. Mr. Aldrich's amended documents, by contrast, bear a date stamp that postdates the original filing by 14 months. The rate and principal changes were made after the fact. The signature on the amended documents does not match Mr. Beckett's signature on any other instrument in the county record. The room was quiet. Pembley said something about chain of custody again. The hearing officer said, "We've heard that point, Mr. Pembley." Vernon Aldrich's face, across the table, was very still. Not the blankness of someone who doesn't understand what is happening, but the stillness of someone who understands exactly and is calculating quickly whether there is still a way out. There was not. Agnes had made sure there was not. By the time the other 2 cases were raised, the widow in Carsten, the farmer outside Greybell, both of whom Agnes had contacted directly and who had, in the end, agreed to add their names to the filing, the picture was complete, and it was exactly the picture Nora had needed it to be. The property lien was declared invalid. The amended loan documents were ruled fraudulent. Vernon Aldrich was relieved of his position as county financial officer pending a full investigation, and his banking license was suspended that same afternoon. He did not look at Nora again when he left the room. She watched him go. She felt nothing dramatic. She had expected something, triumph or relief, or some large emotion that matched the size of what had happened. Instead, she felt something quieter and more durable, the particular satisfaction of a column of numbers that finally, after 3 years, balanced. Millhaven found out the way Millhaven always found out about things, piece by piece, and then all at once, and then everyone had an opinion, and most of them conveniently forgot that they had spent 3 years treating Nora Beckett like a burden the town hadn't gotten around to resolving. The Grange held a meeting. Silas Drummond said very little, which Nora found more satisfying than anything he might have said. 2 of the women, who had stopped returning her greetings on the street, came by separately to tell her they had always believed her, which she received politely, because she was not in the business of telling people how wrong they were when they had already figured it out themselves. The building was hers again. Legally, cleanly, without qualification. She stood in it the morning after the papers were signed and looked at the empty shelves and the floor that needed sweeping, and the counter her father had built himself from pine boards and iron brackets, and she thought about what she wanted to do with it. She did not want to run a general store. She had spent 3 years learning something she hadn't expected to learn, that the law, which she had once thought of as a distant, impersonal thing, was actually just a system of documents and precedents and procedures, and that a person who understood the system could use it. Not against people. For them. Agnes Ford had shown her that. Cole had shown her a different version of it, that the same careful attention he brought to surveying land, the insistence on looking at what was actually there, rather than what someone claimed was there, was exactly what the documents had needed. She wanted to understand it better, formally, all the way through. Agnes, when she told her, had looked at her for a moment and then said, "I've been waiting for you to say that." Cole was still in Millhaven in December. The survey work had extended, complications with one of the eastern parcels, a boundary dispute that needed resolving before the route could be finalized, and he had not said anything about leaving that felt final. They had not spoken directly about what they were. This was something they had both, by some unspoken agreement, decided to leave alone, while more pressing things were pressing. But on an afternoon in early December, when the first real snow came and turned the main street into something that looked almost forgiving, he found her in the building, her building, measuring the front room to see if she could fit a desk and 2 chairs and a small bookcase in the northwest corner. "What are you planning?" he asked from the doorway. "An office," she said. "I'm going to article with Agnes Ford. 2 years, maybe 3. She has more work than she can handle alone, and I know the county records better than almost anyone at this point." He leaned against the doorframe. Outside, the snow was coming down in that slow, unhurried way it had when it intended to stay. "And after that?" "After that," she said, "I'm going to practice in Millhaven. There are a lot of people in this county who have needed someone like Agnes and couldn't afford the ride to the district seat. She looked at her measurements, and I'm going to do it from this building. My father spent 22 years in this building being useful to people. I think that's a good use for it." Cole was quiet for a moment. "You should know," he said, "that the eastern parcel dispute has been resolved." She stopped measuring. "The survey work is done," he continued, in the same careful, even tone he used when he was saying something that mattered and trying to say it correctly. "I could leave next week. The job's finished." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the same steadiness he always had, not urgent, not asking anything, just present, just clear, the way he had always been clear with her since the first night at the Grange when he'd said the truest thing anyone had said about her in years. "But," she said, "but I've been talking to the county assessor's office about taking on some local contract work. Ongoing. There's a lot of land in this county that hasn't been properly surveyed in 30 years, and after everything that's come out about how records were being managed, they're interested in doing it right." He paused. "If there's a reason to stay." Nora looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked around the room, at the empty shelves, the pine counter, the window that looked out onto the main street of the town she had almost lost and then reclaimed, inch by inch, document by document, by refusing to believe that a column that wouldn't balance couldn't be corrected. "There's a reason to stay," she said. The snow kept falling. Outside, Millhaven went about its December business, smoke from the chimneys, the sound of the farrier's hammer from 2 streets over, the bell above the dry goods that rang when someone opened the door. The same sounds she had grown up hearing, the same town. But the building was hers now, and what she was going to do with it was hers, and the man in the doorway had chosen, with no obligation and no audience, to stay. She went back to her measuring. He came inside and held the other end of the tape.